Hi, and welcome again to the third of four webinars presented in a collaboration between the National Consumer Voice and the National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Resource Center. My name is Sherry Gibson, licensed psychologist. And again, I am so happy and privileged to be bringing to you another webinar, hopefully in a time during which might be a good topic to address. What we feel is also an important issue right now, that is compassion fatigue during a time of COVID-19. Today's webinar is a primer for administrators. As you know, and I know, the work that you do, that we do, is technically demanding. The work requires for us to be very accurate in the technical side of what we do. There are time schedules to coordinate. There's complex logistics in running a long-term care community. But it also demands a lot of our humanity. Our minds, our hearts, our spirits are unavoidably challenged by the fact that in your work, particularly right now, you face death, human grief, and suffering on a daily basis. If we're not aware or trained or skilled about attending to ourselves as we are to our technical duties and to our residents and their families and staff, direct care staff, we risk not only technical and service difficulties, but the erosion, even the breakdown of ourselves and our whole lives. This erosion of both our work efficiency and our whole lives has come to be called compassion stress or compassion fatigue. And especially during this time of COVID, the combination and complexity of isolation of residents, death, anxiety, grief, all combined create a perfect recipe for the development of fatigue and burnout and compassion fatigue. Often begs us to wonder if there is ever light at the end of the tunnel. How do we help others during a time of uncertainty? What do we say to the grieving daughter who's lost her mother or who is afraid of losing her loved one when she can only watch that person through a window or maybe only talk on the phone? What do we say to other family members or particularly our staff when they are caring for people day in and day out who are also anxious, worried, isolated, maybe grieving themselves? What do we say to others to make them feel better in that moment? One of the things that I'd like to just take a moment to talk about is how do we normalize anxiety? Right now, it is a very anxious time. And anxiety, just at its very basic understanding, is when we are worried or concerned about things that haven't happened or might happen. It's essentially the unknown, the future. And so it's really important that we normalize that when people are anxious in our midst. We can say things like, it is very appropriate to feel anxious right now. I can understand why you feel anxious. It's also critical that we help the person focus on coping, asking them questions about what would be most helpful to you right now and what things are in your control. Now you'll notice that those two questions is not us telling somebody what to do, not us giving advice about what to do, but actually taking a person-centered approach, and we've had a webinar on person-centeredness, person-centered thinking, is that we tap into the other person's strengths. What do? They are the wise people who know themselves best. And so what may be helpful for me in coping with anxiety may not translate to somebody else, and their ability to cope. So again, focusing on what they can do and asking them, what is in your repertoire? What are the things that are in your control right now? And finally, focusing on areas of certainty, what we know to be true in this moment, and gratitude. Questions that you can ask or pose to people are, what are you most certain of right now? Are you just most certain that you know that you're going to get your needs met today? Or are you most certain that you can come to the window and see your loved one today? And that at the end of the day, you are going to have dinner with your family? What are the things that you know to be true? And what are the areas in your life around which you have gratitude? Getting people to tap into gratitude is really, really important. And in some of my work as a therapist, I will often recommend that people start a gratitude journal, that at the end of each day, they write 3 things that they're thankful for. And as we focus or refocus our attention on those things around which we have gratitude, then we can start to reframe and we can start to see hope. And we can look around us through a different lens, not always through grief or anxiety or suffering, but through the lens of hope and maybe some optimism and gratitude. I suspect that most of you have heard the term of compassion fatigue, but I'm going to break it down in terms of what is compassion. So compassion is kind of tough because we often think of empathy and sympathy as the same thing. And if you attended one of the other webinars, I showed you a video by Brene Brown where she talks about the differences between empathy and sympathy. And compassion is very different from those two things. You see here on this slide a picture of Gandhi and Mother Teresa. These are great healers of our time that we all have some familiarity with. We know that they walked the world and maybe streets of even our communities where they saw enormous amounts of suffering, and they held a healing place, a sacred space for people who were suffering. They walked alongside them, prayed with them, listened to them, looked them in the eye, held their hand. Compassion is essentially an emotional response when we perceive suffering that involves an authentic desire to want to help. It's derived from Latin and Greek roots, patai and pathian, meaning to suffer, and com, meaning with. So to suffer with. It's also well documented in our history. In Christianity, we know the story of the Good Samaritan. Confucius is the major teacher of the Golden Rule, do unto others as you would have done unto you. The 13 attributes of compassion. And in Buddha, we know that loving kindness and compassion is part of all practice. The Dalai Lama believed that the individual experience of compassion radiates outward and increases harmony for all. The Dalai Lama is quoted saying, "Compassion is a necessity, not a luxury, and without it, humanity cannot survive." And in fact, Charles Darwin believed that there was an evolutionary component to compassion, that potentially it wasn't the survival of the fittest, but survival of the kindest. In one of his writings from The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, he wrote, "Communities which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring." And it is true, there is something about the empathy that we feel towards others that translates into helping relieve suffering, that does support communities in thriving. We take care of each other because when we do that, we thrive as a species. We thrive as a family. We thrive as a community. All these are true. So simply put, compassion is the feeling of sorrow or concern coupled by that desire to alleviate suffering. So you can think about it as I feel for you, which is sympathy. I understand you, which is empathy. Plus, I want to help. Those all together make compassion. But as most of you know, as do I, there's a cost to our caring. The work that you do in long-term care is very much centered on the relief of suffering. And often it involves absorbing information about suffering. And sometimes we can take on the feeling of that suffering itself. We refer to this phenomenon as secondary victimization or vicarious trauma. It's also been known as trauma by concern. And what happens here is that because we are watching the suffering of other people, perhaps the dying, the grief, we are listening to stories, sitting beside people. You might even be holding the hand of a person who is actively dying in your community. And by virtue of being there, witnessing it, being witness to it, we can take on that suffering to a degree that it stays with us and it affects us. It can affect our dreams. It can affect our emotional state, our attention, our concentration. It can lead to symptoms of depression, anxiety, hypersensitivity to our environment, to noise, to light, to any kind of stimuli. And so that is the cost of what we do. There's another term called kismal trauma that essentially is an intersection where trauma that is experienced at the community level also affects us, or trauma that affects maybe one member of the community has a reverberating effect and it affects the whole community. This couldn't be more true than in long-term care communities right now during a time of COVID. When you see the suffering and the illness, perhaps death by natural causes perhaps, or death secondary to COVID, that can impact everybody. In fact, yesterday I was on a call with a team, and one of the ladies on the call, another professional in my community, said that her aunt is living in a skilled nursing facility, and her aunt was talking about how sad she felt because somebody had died in her community, and that she didn't feel that they were given the type of opportunity like they used to be to grieve and to have a ceremony or a memorial of some sort, a ritual. And that had a reverberating effect throughout the residents there. There were many people who were talking about their grief and not feeling like they could connect in the way that they used to be able to connect because of the isolation that they're experiencing now from COVID. And so this does have a reverberating effect on everybody in the community. The study of compassion fatigue has been around since the early 1990s and was introduced by Joynson and further developed by Figley and colleagues, who put together a model to understand what is the process around which compassion fatigue develops. What are the pathways from what maybe factors predispose us more to developing compassion fatigue, and what are the things that happen along the way that make that possible? This model has been used to describe the development of those symptoms and in multiple different care settings, particularly in nursing and in caregiving, both formal and informal caregiving. So I want to show you the model just to kind of give you something to think about and reflect on as you work with staff and residents and even yourself. You have three things that happen first. At the top to the very far left, you have an exposure to suffering. You also have at the very bottom concern, genuine concern for the individual, for the situation. And then what we bring into it is our ability to be empathic. All of those three things leads to an empathic response. Then you add detachment at the very top and a sense of satisfaction. These are very critical pieces to the work we do. We have to be able at some level to detach from the suffering and the work that we do. When we become too attached, and that can be in the long hours that we do, it could be the way that we think about the work when we go home, our ability to detach or not detach also sets us up. The other part of that is our sense of satisfaction. When we have a high sense of satisfaction, we are protected from the development of compassion fatigue. But as these things start to erode at us, our satisfaction becomes lower and decreased. This then leads to what is termed as residual compassion stress. So we start feeling the stress of our compassion. Two other important things happen here. We have prolonged exposure to the suffering. So while you had the exposure to the suffering, you're seeing it day in, day out, every day. You're also right now in long-term care communities, people are working long shifts. They may be taking on double shifts because they're filling in where staff have left. In the worst case scenarios where staff have died. And so there's a prolonged exposure. Coupled with, at the bottom there, you'll see traumatic memories. So anytime we've been exposed to suffering, whether it's in our current situation or we're triggered by prior suffering that we have witnessed, those memories can also play a role here. There's one other very important component that was added, and that is other life stressors. Because we all know that our work is just one element of our life. It's an important one. Work is, for some of us, a very big part of our identity. However, we also have to go home to other demands. Many of you, and particularly your staff, you may be in a caregiving situation at home. Many people are having to now homeschool their children as school has now started and schools are empty because of COVID. And now you're having to bring the classroom to your home. People have other demands such as job loss, loss of insurance. They may have young children at home, and while they're working in long-term care communities, the anxiety of going home and possibly spreading something to their young ones, or an elderly parent who might be living with them. These are all demands that are pressed upon people in addition to all of the work that they're doing. And so you can see very easily how all of this combined leads to a pathway of compassion fatigue. A few other things that are really important to note here are both external and internal factors that contribute to compassion fatigue. By external factors, I mean the work environment, essentially. And the work environment encompasses several things. One, the support of a community. And that support can look like the policies and the regulations. Is there social acceptance and activism that happens within a work environment? The work setting itself is also a very important factor here, the physical environment. the employer's values and the culture, the tasks and the deadlines that have to be met? Is there a collegial culture? What is the management makeup? All of these things also set us up. In addition to the external factors, there are 6 futilities, if you will, that's been identified that can also erode at our personal well-being. And that is how we perceive the suffering. What do we tell ourselves about the suffering? The resident and the family demands is part of this. Constantly having to address the anxieties, fear, worry, maybe even anger of residents and families. The institutional demands. And for many of you out there, it's a constant changing landscape with regulations, re-entry, phases of that, communication and treatment errors that happen in any kind of healthcare setting, feelings of inadequacy. This is an important one to reflect on. I'll bet if we were in a room together and I asked you to identify who in the room feels inadequate in their job, based on what I've done in the past, most people raise their hands. And particularly during this time where we don't have any answers and our assailant, COVID-19, is invisible to us. How can we not feel inadequate during this time? How can we not feel consistently chasing a moving target, not being masterful at hardly anything when it's constantly changing? And then finally, the sense that our care may not be benefiting the resident or the family. These are the types of things that impact us and again erode at our whole selves. And we have internal factors. The internal factors, as I said before, empathy, which most of us in the helping professions have, it is a gift and a curse. High empathy helps us to understand people, and it can also challenge our equanimity. Our personal history and our personalities also plays an important role here. Your temperament, how you deal with stress, how you manage ambiguity or the unknown. Our own family and social history is important. Our culture, our ethnicity, our family traditions, our ability to hold personal boundaries. Are you more boundaried or are you less boundaried? Finding somewhere in between is always better. If we're too boundaried, then we're not approachable. And if we have no boundaries, then we get ourselves into some trouble. Also, if we have unresolved personal trauma. Now, can people who have trauma, who are experiencing trauma, do good work? Yes, they can. And it's also important that we're addressing our trauma. We're helping resolve the trauma. But when it's unresolved, that can be a problem. And then finally, the overgeneralization that happens. That means taking on somebody's explanation of their suffering, or taking on your own experience of suffering and saying that because I experienced it this way, then you experience it this way. Thinking that others' experiences are similar to ours. When we do that, we can also end up in some problematic situations because we have to always come into every situation and every experience with our residents, with our coworkers, with our peers, to know that my experience is going to be different from your experience. Even if we are in similar situations, you're going to interpret a situation differently than I do. I'll bet that any of you who grew up with siblings can probably name a couple of things in your growing up together where you saw it very differently than your sibling. and yet you were raised under the same roof, maybe by the same parents. Another internal factor is what we refer to as pathological altruism. And that is this combination of having an excess of empathy and an inability to self-regulate, being more focused on relieving my own discomfort rather than another's. So this looks like a person who will overextend themselves, not because they really want to help the other person, but because they feel so uncomfortable about the situation. And that can get us into trouble too. And it can certainly lead to compassion fatigue. If I'm extending myself almost in a pathological way, I'm always stepping in, always fixing. I don't see the strength of the other person to do some of that on their own. And I'm going to burn out really quickly if that's what I do. So there are two things that happen to us: burnout versus compassion fatigue. I want to talk about both of these things because in the literature, burnout has been shown to be different from compassion fatigue. Burnout is this kind of gradual erosion of our physical, mental, and emotional state. And it's due to long-term involvement in emotionally demanding or unfulfilling situations. Some of the symptoms of burnout can be just complete exhaustion, physically, mentally draining. There's also a depersonalization that happens. So a person feeling very hardened or numb to the job. When I hear a person say, you know, this job, I just show up, I clock in, I clock out, I get my paycheck, I go home. That sounds like burnout to me. The last piece of this is an achievement void, feeling no accomplishment or reduced accomplishment in our work and low satisfaction. Burnout can happen in any job, in any profession. It can be the thing that does some human services in, rather than the compassion factors. Burnout stems from a combination of those external and internal factors that are frustrating and not fulfilling one's professional aspirations or values. Compassion fatigue, on the other hand, feels very similar to burnout. But what happens in compassion fatigue is that the symptoms, if you will, emerges very suddenly. There's this existential and spiritual effect of compassion fatigue, an overarching sense that work and life itself is meaningless, worthlessness, and hopelessness. There's a sense of isolation from supporters and a hypervigilance or fear. And the symptoms, as perceived by the person experiencing compassion fatigue, often don't make the connection between their symptoms and the real cause. And so what often happens here is that a person will, because it comes on so suddenly, they'll just quit their job. They'll walk in and say, that's it, this is my last day. This is the kind of thing that people will sometimes even leave an entire field, an entire profession. I want to go through some of the signs and symptoms of compassion fatigue. For the individual, I've listed here difficulty with concentrating, a feeling of exhaustion, preoccupation with the job itself. Some people might have nightmares or flashbacks, an overreaction or avoidance of sensory or emotional stimuli. Some people report that they'll, for instance, stop listening to music. They'll stop doing things that they once enjoyed because it's too much for them. There's a chronic physical ailments that come up, and some ailments that have been associated with compassion fatigue include colds and stomach problems, apathy, or a clinical term called anhedonia, which is a loss of finding pleasure in what typically would be a pleasurable activity. And excessive negativity, blaming others, complaining, putting down management, always having critique about the system. Compulsive or avoidant behaviors such as substance abuse, overspending, overeating, gambling, watching too much television. We call that TV escapism. Problems in personal relationships with intimacy or maintaining relationships. A denial of difficulties or problems. Have you ever known somebody, maybe somebody at work, and you could tell that they're just not doing well? And you might even say, hey, you okay? And the person says, yep, I'm fine. That kind of reaction to me is a red flag that more needs to be explored. They're not ready to talk about it, and they don't want to talk about it. But that reaction, yeah, I'm fine, is usually an indicator that something's not fine. One of the key factors I will say here is with compassion fatigue, it's an inability to see it in ourselves. So I strongly encourage you to make some quiet personal space at some point. And I'm going to be including some assessments that will be attached to the webinar, available to you, that I'd like for you to take and see where you fall on compassion fatigue and personal stress. The sooner you recognize it and attend to it, the easier it is to address those symptoms. And it's also an opportunity for you to develop the skills to minimize the development of symptoms in the future. There are also symptoms that reverberate through the institution. So for example, we see high absenteeism or high staff turnover when people are suffering from compassion fatigue. Increased difficulty completing tasks and assignments or meeting deadlines. Unprofessional outbursts of anger or even aggression. Instability, conflict with team members or with staff, relationships, maybe even instability in care. A desire among staff to break the company rules. Inflexibility, increased rigidity, a resistance to change. And in this climate, it's an ever-changing environment. Excessive complaining, negativity towards management, or skepticism or apathy about the organization, the vision of the organization or the future. And an inability of staff to believe that improvement is possible. And here's where I want to address a difficult but also important appeal for compassion for each other. When a coworker or a staff member is beginning to exhibit some of these attitudes or behaviors, our instinctual response is probably not compassion, is it? It's usually irritation, avoidance, reprimand. But if someone is compassion fatigued, and by the way, you bet it can be even a bereaved family member who was a caregiver. But when someone is exhibiting signs of compassion, stress, and fatigue and being difficult, it's important and amazing actually to offer a compassionate approach to that person and give them some feedback. It will help them reconnect to their humanity and maybe develop compassion for themselves. And here's the really good news. There are healthy, positive ways to stave off those edge states, if you will, to prevent them from developing, to heal them when they start. We are susceptible to compassion fatigue because our bodies tell us when we are in danger. The sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are involved in this process, this biological process. You're all familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze response, and it's an adaptive response in a real crisis, but day after day, it can wilt us. The parasympathetic nervous system is what restores our physiological equanimity. It keeps us rooted and helps us tend and thrive. So in a time of COVID, day in and day out, we are being probably triggered. Our flight, fight, or freeze response is being activated, maybe even hourly in some communities. And so when that is always happening, it is even more important that we take time to bring ourselves back into equanimity, homeostasis. Those heightened states of anxiety, uncertainty, unknown about the future, making decisions every minute of the day and assessing for risk, and the chronicity of all of those things, combined with the perception that there is no end in sight, all of these make this time so critical for us and couldn't be more important for us to find ways to protect ourselves and to tend to ourselves. So how do we do that? Well, the antidote to vicarious trauma, burnout, compassion fatigue is resilience. When you hear the term resilience, what comes to mind? I like to think of a rubber band. So it's defined in two ways. A rubber band, the ability of something to return to its original shape after it's been pulled, stretched, pressed, or bent. Psychologically, it's the ability to recover from or adjust easily to a misfortune or a change. We need to build and develop those skills to stay well, not only for better performance, but also for our well-being in this high compression stress work. Some resiliency seems to be inborn, but the really exciting news here is that it can also be developed and trained. Just like those who undertake physical conditioning in athletics, we can train and condition our mental and physical reflexes and abilities for better performance and well-being in this work. And indeed we should, because these abilities are just as important to our success as is our technical training that we do. The skill sets that we need to develop are available to us, but I don't want you to feel any pressure around that. Now, if you're not a touchy-feely person who loves to share your feelings and explore deeper meaning in your life, that's okay. You don't have to enter into psychotherapy or go on a vision quest or sing Kumbaya with your colleagues to do this. There's nothing wrong with that either. But here's the truth. The stress of your work has more in common with a military combat medic than with an investment banker or an engineer. Your work is nothing short of heroic. And heroic work requires extra level of self-awareness, self-discipline, and self-care. You ever notice how superheroes fall when they do? Or how they can get suddenly weakened or taken advantage of by the most subtle personal vulnerabilities? Think of those mystic heroes or superheroes, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman. What brings them to their knees? You all are heroes out there, and you don't have to have a tragic fall or a ruin, but yet let's build your resistance to your kryptonite. Resiliency skills starts with self-awareness. Self-awareness, first part of this, is to our physical and emotional well-being. being consciously attuned to your body, your mind, your emotions, and your spirit, so that you know how you are being and presenting in this moment in order to take care of yourselves and others simultaneously. One tip is to just think about what's going on in your body. And when you're working, particularly, might be a clue or a barometer of what's happening in your staff and others. So knowing how tired or alert you are, how tensed or relaxed, how events or information coming in are impacting you emotionally and existentially, these are keys to responding in ways that not only will further your objectives, but also ensure the best possible outcome. And it will allow you to take care of yourself now and later. The other part of self-awareness is self-awareness to our technical job. So this needs to include kind of a personal assessment of what your professional strengths and growing edges are. What skills and knowledge bases are natural talents for you, and where might you put some more effort into developing? Some examples might be, I don't know about you, but when I've worked in certain settings, there's a healthcare record system, an electronic health record system. And I've been in certain settings where they have changed from one system to another system. I don't know of any other technically challenging transition to a system that can happen except for one of these things. And when I was going through that in one of my previous jobs, I was a director over a behavioral health department. We had 700 and plus residents or participants, and I had a staff of 11. Well, when we switched over our EHR, I decided that I didn't need to go to all the trainings. I just needed to know how to pull up a note, how to sign a note, how to look at a treatment plan. Pretty basic. So I didn't go to all of the trainings for this EHR system because I was too busy doing other things. Well, you can imagine we rolled out the system and then I was stuck. I didn't know how to do hardly anything. And I realized that I needed a lot of training. Well, instead of going to get that training initially, because I was so busy, I would pull in my colleagues or staff and ask them, hey, how do you do this? How do you pull up that? Where do I go to look for this? And I realized that's very ineffective. Not only is it ineffective for me, but I'm pulling other people out of their work to teach me something that I should have done initially. This is the kind of thing that can really wear at us. So ask yourself, what are the things technically that you do that you need to get better at to be more efficient, to limit your stress, or to even limit the amount of stress you place on others because you're not proficient at something. The third part of this is our existential. Our existential awareness comes from the nature of the work that you're doing. As I said, you're working in a heroic field that is on the edge of life and death right now. The nature of that work begs all the big questions from us, both existential and spiritual. You will do well to have some kind of practice for processing and coping with those things. In our culture, some people are intentional about religious, spiritual, or ethical practices, and some folks aren't. And in this line of work, there's some hard research evidence that indicates that consciously exploring your questions about life and death, truth and justice, good and evil, having some sort of language and practice for which to cope with those things can help you deal with it better. And whatever you believe or understand now, this work will constantly pose new experiences that will challenge you and your perceptions and your beliefs and your understanding so that you can continually grow. The other piece of the resilience skill building is self-regulation. This involves three things. Self-regulation is not something a lot of us have been taught in life, and it's not highly valued in our culture because it's not very exciting to be regulated. And we love excitement, don't we? But self-regulation is very important on our work, which involves excitement overload. Self-regulation is about how to use your self-awareness to have more conscious control over your perceptions, your communications, and your behavior. It's about being keenly, consciously aware of your physical and emotional responses right now, right in this moment and ongoing, so that you can manage how you are being and presenting to others, to take care of yourself now so that things don't haunt you so much later. This is something that athletes, mental health and protection professionals learn, but not a lot of the rest of people learn this. In fact, many of us have been taught that it's virtuous to ignore or tune out of our bodies, our emotions, and our spirits. But this is dangerous in this work that you do. You can greatly affect not only your own well-being, but your effectiveness with others. Knowing how to instantly assess and regulate your level of awareness and arousal is key to not only achieving your work objectives, but taking care of yourself and those who you are serving. And it's not difficult to do. Self-care skills are often more familiar to people considering prevention for burnout or compassion fatigue. But there are some less conventional but evidence-based caveats for people in this line of work. Yes, it's important to eat well, exercise, get enough sleep, but it needs to be in ways that are sustainable and reasonably enjoyable for you. If a particular diet or exercise problem causes you more frustration, or is just one overconsumption of your time and effort, let it go and try something else. Moderation tends to be more successful and sustainable than going militant on something. Have regular fun like your life depends on it, because it does. In this line of work, and particularly now during a pandemic, you need to get a life and you need to keep it. Spending your working life in the face of death will sap the life out of you. When people in the media are carrying on about all of the horrible things that are happening in our world, not only related to COVID, but also the racial injustices and the political environment that is now in our faces. We need to be able to talk about our process. We need to be able to talk to people in order to make sense of it. And it's important to talk with the right person. Engaging with people and activities that literally make you laugh or not feel like you have to filter yourself. Kids and pets are always great for this, or sports, games, activities. You've got to rest your frontal lobes. You've been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of decision making. Get out of your executive functioning, if you will, and use other faculties and senses. Cooking, arts, music, sports, contact with nature is probably one of the most well-documented cures for trauma and PTSD. I want you to take a moment. It may not be now, but maybe after this webinar. I want you to list a mini escape or diversion that worked well for you to restore and renew yourself. List one thing that brings you joy and ask yourself, when was the last time you did it? What gets in the way of you doing it more often? And what are your personal triggers indicating that it's time to recharge your batteries? You also need to talk it out. Talking is probably the most effective way of preventing and healing from compassion fatigue, but who you talk to is incredibly important. That person has to be someone with whom you can really relate. That person has to be present without interfering with your process or one-upping you with their story. And they need to understand confidentiality. That person may or may not be your spouse. It may or may not be your best friend, and it may or may not be somebody who you work with professionally. And if you don't have somebody that you can do that with who meets those criteria, then please reach out to your employee assistance program and utilize those benefits. Most organizations have those benefits. It's confidential. You usually get 6 to 8 free sessions. And it's an important mechanism for processing some difficult stuff. And when all else fails, you might have to ask yourself some really important questions. Are you still committed to the agency's mission, values, and culture? The physical environment and its resources, the structure of your organization, and your colleagues, managers, supervisors. It's important to consider and evaluate those external factors about whether this work is or still is right for you and right for your life. This work is really very stressful, and there's nothing wrong or less of you if it doesn't fulfill you or costs more than it pays you and just means that it may not be your thing. Sometimes it's helpful for us to have permission to know that maybe it's not the right place for us. And it's important to evaluate those things rather than letting things explode and just walking out. Have a very personal, deep conversation with yourself around those things, if at all they're coming up for you. You want to dig where the ground is soft, which is a Chinese proverb. Don't go for the big items on your checklist. Avoid those trickiest areas that you need to fix, and pick something that you can do easily. You can visualize changing or improving. One question that I ask a lot in therapy with my clients is, what's the smallest thing you could do that would make the biggest difference? Take stock of what's on your plate. Make a list of the demands that suck your time and energy, and figure out what stands out. What factors there contribute to the overflowing of your plate? You might want to brainstorm this with a friend or a colleague. See if there's ways to delegate. And delegation, by the way, not only happens in the workplace, but also happens at home. Are there things that other family members can be doing that you don't have to take on? Start a self-care collection. Ask friends what they do. Start making your own list. Try new ideas. Maybe do it on your team. Start a contest. Create self-care boards. Initiate 5 minutes of self-care at each staff meeting, where someone is in charge of bringing new ideas to your group. Find time for yourself every day to rebalance your workload and to rebalance yourself. Delegate, create transitions. Now this is interesting. Some of you may or may not be working at home. Transitioning from work to home was a thing we talked a lot about when we actually worked in our workplaces. How do you change your clothes when you get home? Do you listen to music? Do you take a walk when you get back to home? Those of us who are working in home, this becomes even more challenging, and we have to find ways of transitioning. So some final thoughts. Self-awareness is key, if not vital, to appreciating your own reaction to stress. Look for those behavioral cues of your staff that might indicate trouble areas. Become compassionate around your reaction. View others through that lens of curiosity and empathy. Utilize key resources to prevent compassion fatigue or intervene when you notice problems. I've included here some references for you to the Compassion Fatigue Awareness Project. I have their website listed here for you. They have some great resources on this website. Some of them which we'll be including with this webinar. Some other readings for you to look into. And I want to thank you very much for today. Remember, there are also resources through both NORC and Consumer Voice where you can find information on trauma-informed and person-centered care approaches and other resources there. I've also listed here the social media mechanisms for connecting with both the National Long-Term Care Ombudsman Resource Center and the Consumer Voice. And again, we thank you very much for spending this time with us today. Take care and be well.